Breaking news! Video games, they exist! Not only that though, but video games exist more now than they ever have in the past, both in sheer numbers and in cultural influence as well. During the span of the 7th and especially 8th console generations in particular, the industry turned into something with a strong presence, but still relatively self-contained fanbase of perceived geeks and shut-ins into an absolute giant pillar of the realm of entertainment. Amongst younger generations especially, video games are as big or even arguably bigger than TV now, which has a good game. God, I hate that word. Yeah, okay, that's way better. Which, as a gamer, I think is quite absurd. Video games are by far the most interactive, personal, and immersive form of household entertainment, since you quite literally have at least partial control of the stories, if not forming them entirely on your own, using the games as a catalyst for the interactions with friends and strangers alike. However, the reasons I want to give video games my money and the reason that they've been getting so much more money as of recent are not perfectly aligned. Unfortunately, a large portion of humans with expendable incomes did not wake up one day and suddenly realize that video games are fucking awesome. Rather, the large corporations that have their gross, shadowy monster hands on certain intellectual properties did what they do best and figured out how to min-max their profits, in part by advertising to a larger, lower, and/or more influenceable denominator, and in part by reducing the amount of actual work they have to do, or, well, I guess more reducing the amount that they have to pay the actual people doing the work by reducing the scope of their work. There was also a certain service that became way more widely available and integrated into society during this time period that drastically shifted how these corporations could and would direct future endeavors. Do we have any guesses from the crowd? Here's a hint. You're using it right now to watch this video. I was doing the whole thing. Do you just hate fun? Whatever, this is all just a lot of words to say that the internet changed how we can develop games. There was no longer some huge cost to putting out games due to requiring to print them on discs or cartridges. Developers could simply pay a small fee that didn't scale with how many copies you sold to host their games on a server. This also cut out the middleman of game stores, meaning you didn't have to convince a major publisher or store chain that your game is going to make money in order to get it out to the public. Which is especially handy if you're, say, an indie studio without an established fanbase or massive advertising budget. Yes, despite what I said in the intro, our topic today actually starts with the little guys. Another direct consequence of hosting your games for purchase online is the ability to change what the game actually contains without having to ship a new version of the product out, leaving the people who already bought the previous versions in the dust. This concept is what the kids nowadays call updates and downloadable content. With this in mind, it isn't too much of a logical leap to see how a developer may start releasing unfinished products to the public, either out of corporate greed, or to get consistent user feedback and funding to ensure a better end product. And I'm actually not feeling very sinful at the moment, so let's start with that second thing about indie games or whatever. You know, the low budget, no publicity, small teams of developers that fly under the radar of most users. Oh, don't look at me like that, we're talking about the early 2010s, remember? While Minecraft is not the first instance of a video game that was released incrementally to the public, it is most certainly one of the most known, and its development in particular is, conveniently, fairly interesting as well. The first releases were pretty directionless and impulsive, with the long-term goal of the game flip-flopping all over the place. The creator, whoever the f*** it was, some loser nobody I'm sure, took a lot of ideas from the fans, and in the early days, that was half the appeal. In a sort of ironic way, the game had the potential to become anything. Nothing was off the table. Players kept coming back to it because there was always something new about it, something to discuss and play around with. It didn't really matter all that much what the creator, I honest to God really don't feel like Googling, wanted the game to become, which, if you're unaware, was actually quite different from the sandbox we know and possibly love today. There was a lot more talk in the early days to make the game much more combat-focused, with the randomized world being an additional gimmick rather than the main appeal. The dev notes actually really remind me of the modern indie action roguelike Muck. What ultimately drove the game into the direction we know it for now is the community loving all the random additions that didn't serve a grander purpose other than to be what they are. The creator, who I really should just give a fake name to at this point, Hatsune Miku. Once Miku had added enough random little things, the lack of identity became the identity. The player always decided for themselves what they wanted their worlds to become, creating a unique and personal attachment to the stories that they created. This video isn't about Minecraft though, so for the moment I don't really care about the quality or success of it. In fact, I'll shit on it right now just for fun. Mining, which is half of the title of the game, was absolutely horrible for way too many years. The main line of progress is hilariously short, and the fact that Rana, who is objectively peak character design by the way, was nuked from the game after just 2 days of Precious existence, is grounds for a class action lawsuit, to be quite frank. What the hell is this video about again? Oh, yeah, okay. So once Minecraft had its full 1.0 release as a complete game, development didn't just stop. Miku still had ideas, and the game was, from the very beginning, fueled by the fact that it constantly had new things to play around with, so why stop adding new content? This game is in one of the 2 soft categories that I'll be referencing throughout this video, which I will call infdev, both being a cool reference and also meaning games that are developed indefinitely, constantly adding new content with no end in sight, with an important distinction of not necessarily being initially planned to be that way, contrary to the second category that I'll keep a secret for now. Ooh. Infdev is not a model that all games can sustain, especially so for any game that has linear progression and a definite end. However, having the game open to the public during development in these kinds of games is actually pretty common and helpful. Take for example Ultra Kill, who I bring up in particular for actually no real reason other than it just got a new update as I'm writing the script, and also the game is f***ing awesome, go play it. The game is strictly single player with a linear, level-based campaign as its core focus. As new levels, weapons, and tweaks are completed, they are released to the public. But that campaign, as far as I can tell, has always been planned to be a set length that is made pretty publicly clear. There's the tutorial prelude and 3 main acts that are each split into 3 layers, 2 layers of 4 levels and 1 layer of 2 for a total of 10 per act. Releasing content before the game is finished helps development by providing concurrent feedback as well as funding, which will lead to a better, more QA-tested, less time-pressured end product, with the trade-off of forcing the game to be developed linearly from the game's start to the end, as well as having to fairly consistently show proof of actual work being done as to not create mistrust amongst the people who paid for an incomplete product with a promise of it being, well, completed. But the kicker here is that it will be completed. Once the 3 acts and possibly some bonus side content are finished, it's finished. The story and mechanics will be fully developed, I assume. The player will feel satisfied, at least most of them probably. And Hakita and the rest of the team can use their massive pile of money, that I hope that they get because they totally deserve, to move on to other things. The point of this tangent being that adding onto a package that already feels complete can just make the product feel less refined and more bloated. Sure, returning players will always have something new to play with in a game that you already know they like, but new players will likely struggle with the wide sea of mechanics and levels and paths and all that hypothetical whatnot that was never under the game's original scope, making everything kind of feel directionless and chaotic, but like the bad kind of chaotic, because the gameplay is already chaotic, but in a good way where you gotta juggle lots of small things and there's explosions and bullets everywhere and you ultimately feel like a badass. The bad kind of chaotic is more like on the macro scale, you know, like overarching feelings about how the game is structured outside of moment-to-moment gameplay that leaves the player lost, confused, and jarred. Hypothetically, of course, I'm not saying that this is the only possible I'm just noticing I spilled a cup of foreshadowing all over the script. Hold on, let me clean this up real quick. Infdev doesn't work for everything, and that's okay. It is not inherently a bad ideology to make games in, though, contrasting, well, everything I just said. Games that are multiplayer focused or sandbox-ish can shoulder the cons much better to let the pros shine. Games like, I don't know, Minecraft. Hey, that's pretty convenient, isn't it? It's like I planned this or something. Anyways, Minecraft, as pretty much everyone knows, is constantly updated with new content with no end in sight to this pattern. This works well for it, like I talked about before, because the appeal of the game is, and always has been, exploring what's possible and using that creative, cute little brain that you have to put the stuff that you find to use in any way that you want. Bloat and lack of direction doesn't knock the game nearly as much when the game, right out the gate, explicitly avoids having direction. I know it's kind of hard to imagine in Kurt you're playing Minecraft completely blind, but the game doesn't tell you any of the mechanics or what your goal is beyond literally walking around and the fact that breaking blocks and crafting are things you can do. Not even like the crafting table or the fact that you gotta arrange materials in shapes similar to the end product. No, literally just the 2x2 crafting grid in your inventory. To a new player, the fact that they're gonna add like archaeology or whatever it is to the game is inconsequential. It's not gonna distract from the main mechanics or storyline or goals of the game because, well, there is no main anything. If a new player comes across archaeology, cool. They might like it and pursue it. They might be confused by it and ignore it. It doesn't really matter all that much whether they stumble their ways into either learning farming or redstone, because there isn't a correct way to play the game. And having so many mechanics available at once isn't really going to confuse or overwhelm anyone because they aren't tossed up in the new players' faces all at once. Compare this to, say, Monster Hunter World and Rise specifically because that's what I'm familiar with. These games, like Minecraft, have a lot of moving parts and mechanics. Unlike Minecraft, there is a main story path and general goal of, well, hunting monsters. And the game obviously should push the player in that direction, but of course it would also be irresponsible to have so many important mechanics not shown to the player. So, logically, the game spends like a good hour or two spamming you with a novel's worth of tutorial text about every thing you see without ever giving you time to test things out on your own or actually embed things into your memory. Even as a returning player, I had an actual physical headache after the first couple of missions in Rise, and even then I still struggled to remember how to do the basic things like go on an exhibition with friends online. This, of course, is absolutely not an issue of game bloat, but rather just being bad at teaching new players. But let's just pretend for a second that there is an open-ended game out there that incrementally added more and more mechanics over time that are all important, or at the very least, able to be effectively used from the start of the game. As a returning player who keeps up with development, it's no issue because you can learn each new thing as it's added one at a time. But to a new player, it would be insanely overwhelming to just throw everything at them all at once. Just close your eyes and imagine for a second a game that spawns you in on an island after the initial cutscenes and whatnot, and the first real interactive gameplay you have is just over a dozen NPCs standing in a line, each explaining one individual mechanic through paragraphs upon paragraphs of text, and then just like give you a checklist of random tasks related to their mechanic. Would that not be just like the worst, most headache-inducing start to any game ever? Anyways, here's a screenshot of the tutorial area of Craftopia. Beyond early access open-world survival games, which, to be fair, there are a lot of, having too many mechanics all at once is not really some big issue like I attempted and probably failed to make it out to be. Because, believe it or not, most games are made with, like, actual intent. Like, making games is hard, dude. There are so many moving parts to even the more simple games. You've really gotta commit to these things to have any worthwhile end product. It's not like a story or a YouTube video script where you can just open up a Word document with a vague, fun idea and something up as you go along. Well, I mean, you can do that in a video game, but the likelihood of a newbie developers actually finishing those types of games, and therefore the likelihood that they'll get any public attention or money, are much, much smaller than other mediums. Let's face it, Minecraft got lucky. Hatsune Miku had some, if not mostly, god-awful ideas for where to take the game in the early stages. And the fact that it somehow managed to avoid every single wrong path it could have driven itself down is close to actual divine intervention. I've kind of been circling around the actual point here that inf dev, while working well in some cases, is not all that popular or sustainable for a couple of reasons. Firstly, nothing is forever. You simply cannot keep adding things onto a different thing forever without eventually altering what the original thing is. Terraria is a game that gets compared to Minecraft in a lot of ways, but for all the similarities they have on the surface, they are fundamentally different in that Terraria is ultimately a linear action game that is hosted within a sandbox-like world. So despite the fact that they have a very similar update model of, continuously adding more and more content ever since it released over a decade ago, the Terraria devs simply cannot keep up with it for as long, and they know this. They've been saying that the next update will be the final update since since version 1.3, which came out in 2015. They said the same thing about version 1.4, nicknamed Journey's End, which came out in 2020. That update won them the 2020 Steam Awards Labor of Love trophy, and as a thanks, they then started working on 1.4.4, the Labor of Love update, which came out in 2022, and then they announced that 1.5 is underway. But hey, the point is, they know that they can't keep going forever. It's a linear action game with a pretty set-in-stone progression and flow. They could theoretically keep moving the goalposts for what the final boss is like they did in the early days, but that has diminishing returns, especially with power creep taken into consideration. Plus, there's that second major issue with ImpDev that I mentioned before, being that games cost money to make and maintain. And just because you keep updating the game, people aren't necessarily going to keep buying the game. Things in general, like not just video games, but most things are just more popular when they're fresh and new. Granted, this isn't always the case. Sometimes the numbers on a thing go up slowly with time, but most things that are big happen all at once with a big bang towards the beginning before trickling down into nothingness over time. It just doesn't make financial sense to rely on only one continuous project if there isn't some sort of subscription model that goes with it. And unfortunately, money is required to live. Oh hey, look, a structurally sound bridge in the main point of the video. Obviously, as internet became accessible to the masses, games started adding dedicated online multiplayer. Unlike most games, there's significantly less reason to iterate upon multiplayer games via a full sequel if your formula and mechanics already work well. Why develop a brand new game spending huge amounts of time and money just for the sake of changing what you already know works? To keep players invested with your game as well as making additional revenue, you can do what the old Street Fighter games did, but in a much more practical way. Paid downloadable content, aka DLC. New maps and game modes and even occasionally extra skins would be made available to play for a small additional price. This became a standard for a while, but there were a couple of issues with it. Most notably, you're separating and gatekeeping players based on what DLC they own, which isn't very fair to those who can't afford more than what they got the base game for. So then came a few different alternate monetization methods. Firstly, skin shops. Exchange in-game cosmetics for real-world money. Simple as that. Much better return on money made versus effort put in, and you aren't screwing over anyone since skins hold no actual gameplay difference. Second is the Battle Pass. This will typically be just a series of rewards that you gain by playing the game and completing in-game challenges that rotate daily and or weekly, with more rewards to those who pay money. These have become pretty popular as of late because they give cosmetics to all players regardless of if they've paid extra money, and because it gives more things to do in the game every day and or week, possibly encouraging players to try different playstyles in order to get their missions done. A lot of versions of this model actually have premium currency as a reward in the premium battle pass, meaning a diligent player can make some of, if not all of their money back just by playing the game. The third and final monetization method is diet gambling. It literally is just gambling, no way around that. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. It's gambling, advertised towards children. Look, to label all gambling as evil would be pretty evangelical, hypocritical of me. When done responsibly, it can be fun for sure, but I'm legally allowed to participate in casinos because my government sees me as mentally mature enough to be responsible for my own money. To allow young children to partake in the same actions is anywhere from ignorant to evil, as most kids don't understand the value of a dollar or the scope of payout chances. Doubly so if they get access to a parent's credit card, where they cannot keep track of how much they're spending, and even if they could, it's not their money. And a lot of kids just don't seem to realize that their parents don't have infinite money. So, maybe there should be some sort of restriction for loot boxes and games that kids will be playing, or at least games advertises themselves as E for everyone. And maybe there shouldn't be an entire genre defined by how prevalent and necessary gambling is to the core gameplay loop.
And I guess just so I'm morally consistent, gambling in content for adults is fine, probably, and this show is made for adults. I hope, actually. Wait, let me just make sure. Penis, sex, gambling, mortgages, and gambling is awesome. Go gamble. And yeah, there we are.
The age of the internet is in full swing, and video game monetization has changed to reflect that, especially with the big boy denim wearing and producing corporate overlords realizing how profitable video games are in the modern day. And this is where that mystery Moscatool can finally reveal itself. Games as a service. You may have heard of the old adage, money can be exchanged for goods and services, with goods being things you can hold and feel and own, like a soft drink or a VHS copy of Donkey Kong Country: The Legend of the Crystal Coconut, and services being actions performed by people or machines, like a haircut or a foot job. Games as a service are designed from the ground up to be continuous and disposable, almost always exclusively hosted on servers, entirely separated from the people who supposedly own the copies of the game. Meaning, when the owners decide it's no longer worth their money to host the game on servers, you see what I did there? Like, it doesn't exist. For online multiplayer games, this makes some degree of sense at least, since they require an active user base to experience the core gameplay. In a hypothetical universe where the upcoming Counter-Strike 2 steals practically all of Valorant's players, and Riot keeps the servers up in spite of that, okay, sure, it's good that they aren't wiping media off the face of the earth, but what's a gamer to do with it in that state? They can wander around the training mode and wait 87 minutes in queue for a single match, I guess. There may even be a couple friend groups that manage to get 10 people together to play a custom game, but the harsh reality of it is that nothing lasts forever. Especially if that thing requires being in the public eye. And that's where the Devil's Advocate segment ends. Time to complain about literally everything to do with games as a service, because holy shit, is it ever an anti-consumer model? Let me start off by backtracking on what I just said, making sure to place my foot on the vital bits and put a little extra weight on them, and maybe twist my foot a little just for good measure. Exactly what purpose does it serve to force a connection to a server to play a game? If I were to disconnect my computer entirely from the internet and try to boot up and play Team Fortress 2, well, I'm obviously going to run into a couple issues, but all data is stored locally, so I can boot up a training map or a game with bots with no issues. This benefits the user in current day by allowing someone without internet access to still get a taste of the game's core gameplay, or practice certain skills, or record footage and scenes and, just not being gated from playing the game that they own. I know this for a fact because, as you may or may not know, I made a video on TF2 specifically while undergoing a bit of an internet crisis that may or may not be still affecting me today. Looking towards the future, there will be a day where Valve stops any and all official support for the game and shuts down its servers. But the community still has all the tools it needs to keep the game alive via community servers. And the average Andy can still get a taste for what once was by using nothing more but the base download, which helps preserve the legacy of a beloved game. In contrast, let's try booting up Apex Legends without internet. Awesome. Not even a training mode or tutorial is accessible. Once EA pulls the plug, the game is gone, never to return or be played, even out of curiosity, ever again. But of course, there's no immediate financial gain for caring about the preservation of art and culture, so why would you ever put in that minuscule amount of extra effort to do so? And this, of course, is the least consequential side, because a lot of campaign-focused experiences with either dedicated single-player or minimal amounts of player interaction are dealing with the same issue. Granted, it's not nearly to the same degree as core multiplayer games or even the battle royale genre alone at this point, but it's still a significant enough plague to be worth looking at. Take Babylon's Fall, for example. Ignoring the quality of the game itself, there was a full story and campaign that could have been enjoyed, hypothetically, by a single person if this was a game that you could own on a disc. But then again, Babylon's Fall wasn't technically a complete package. More missions and stories were to be rolled out over time, but for how long, we really can't say. And well, that's the demon core of this argument. Big studios are less and less incentivized to make actual games as time moves forward. It's way safer to create a skeleton of a product, release that to the public, and only start to fully invest in it if it does well, which is kind of a flawed way of doing things because an incomplete project is less likely to succeed. Especially if it's from a big company who is clearly being lazy, double especially if it's labeled as complete despite clearly being not. Because these games are not made with passion or a goal other than to make money, when they do succeed, future updates carry that same vibe of only being there to make money. they often fall into two perceived categories. Why was this not in the base game? And who the hell asked for this? These corporations have the whole creative process backwards, starting not with a fun idea, but with how to make a profit. And the easiest way to visualize a profit is to just look at what other things are succeeding. Then you add something on top of, or replace something vital in order to be legally distinct and or give reason to the consumer to go for your product over the popular choice. Then they test whether it actually makes money, and only then do they add direction to the project. And well, when your main motivator is safe profit, the direction will almost always follow that closely. You can't healthily iterate on your game if you don't understand what made it fun in the first place. And when you weren't trying to make it fun in the first place, that creates this climate where you just throw shit at a wall to keep your players coming back. Let's reverse back to Minecraft for a minute. Ever since the Microsoft buyout, many would argue that updates follow the two categories I mentioned before, either overhauling aspects of the game that already existed and clearly needed work, such as combat, the end, nether, oceans, villager trading, and caves, or just entirely original content that a lot of the community felt was lackluster. In my opinion, why the original content is rarely received well is because it tends to not interact much, if at all, with other aspects or mechanics of the game, meaning that you aren't actually changing how one could approach the gameplay loop they're familiar with, but rather just widening the pool of things that are in the game. Polar bears, pandas, goats, llamas, and axolotls are all mobs that don't serve any wider purpose other than, I guess, being cool to look at. Which, in a sandbox game, isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially if you're getting actual substantial content with the little bonus key jingles. And wouldn't you know it, Minecraft does that, so case closed! Unfortunately for us, though, other games do exist. Back in 2017, when Fortnite was still known as a PUBG clone, I played the game for a whole season, Season 3 specifically. I enjoyed what it had to offer on a surface level, but as with many other battle royales, it lacked the depth that would allow me to stay interested long term. Looking at footage of the game now, it kind of just gives me a headache. Instead of building upon and deepening the core mechanics of looting, shooting, and building, it seems that Fortnite has just been adding new things and removing old things again and again and again. Low gravity crystals, cars, giant flippy hammers, and I'm not even gonna touch all the crossover content. It doesn't ever seem like they try to build on the core of the game, but rather just rotate as much key jingling trinkets and baubles as possible so the core fans don't get bored. The fact that most of what's added is later removed also induces some amount of FOMO for the regulars, while making sure that the entry point is low enough for anyone who fell off the train or somehow never touched it in the first place, because it's way harder to develop high-level gameplay and tech when you're constantly taking away rungs on the ladder progression. If you can't tell by the tone of my voice, I am not a fan of this wide as an ocean, deep as a puddle direction that a lot of multiplayer games trend towards nowadays. If, say, hypothetically, the developers left the game on the back burner with no major content update for 6 years as they worked on other projects, game like Rumbleverse... Anthem? Sure, Anthem. Games like Anthem would collapse in on themselves as the players run out of ways to play the game and skills to develop, while, say, boomer games, because I know there's people calling me a boomer by now, such as Team Fortress 2, stand strong. Wounded, sure, but strong nonetheless. Even in cases where content isn't explicitly removed at the end of seasons, there is still a big gaping hole of a flaw that comes with focusing on shiny new toys rather than robust fundamental pillars. TF2, because clearly I haven't milked this game enough, has 9 distinct classes with 9 distinct roles. They each serve their own purpose to the game flow in their own way. The medic heals the front line, the engineer holds the fallback point, the scout gets picks on the flank, the heavy is holding down the front line. There's a little bit of overlap because classes are flexible and expressive, but no one outright overshadows anyone else. New classes were never, and will never, be added, because the game itself was built around the classes and the roles they fulfill. Compare this to other modern hero shooters like Overwatch or Valorant. Those games have 3/4 set categories for their characters to fulfill out the gate, so every character ends up stepping on each other's toes and stealing each other's homework, without any room to stand on their own. Very often, the characters are also way more shallow, with glass ceilings to prevent the meta revolving around them. For those who aren't familiar with Valorant, there's 4 main groupings for the playable characters: Controllers, Sentinels, Duelists, and Initiators. Sentinels are focused on controlling a stationary area to make it hard to push into them. Initiators are the opposite, with tools to make them better at pushing into and taking control of sections of the map. Duelists are good at staying alive and winning solo gunfights, and controllers have strong smokes that can control and block the information the other team can gather, forcing either risky plays or wasted time. The thing about these categories and the characters that lie within them is that they all fulfill roughly the same purpose. Every controller is a smoker, every sentinel will lurk, every initiator has a stunner blind, and every insta-lock duelist is a detriment to their team. Team composition is important, but the importance comes from fulfilling roles, not what specific characters fulfill them. The characters aren't pillars to the game, they're disposable, and made to be disposable. They're the shiny new toy I keep talking about, something to play with and forget about, not built to last. When the cast is relatively small, this model isn't all that bad to be honest, but at a certain point, characters become redundant to longtime fans and overwhelming to the new. As Overwatch continued past its first couple years, a horrible meta emerged where characters that could tank the most damage reigned supreme, aka shield meta. The game started to revolve around shooting at or maintaining a glowing square, because there were too many characters that focused on doing exactly that, and they were too effective at doing that. This all loops back to the point I made earlier about not having direction. Blizzard didn't plan the game to become shield-centric, that's just what developed. But that's the thing, Blizzard didn't plan on the game developing in any direction. They just kept stacking samey building blocks on top of each other until it collapsed in on itself, and then they were forced to make drastic changes, in the form of forcing only one tank per team in Overwatch 2. But if they didn't keep adding, well, their player base would have left because the characters and maps tend to lack in depth. The variety doesn't come from how you decide to use each character, but from which character you chose to start with. Everyone is rigid and built for one purpose, because they'd break game balance if they had a raised skill ceiling and or flexibility. Now, for once in my life, let's look at a positive example of AAA games with Apex Legends. Just like Overwatch or Valor, the game has a bunch of characters that all fulfill roles. But Apex stands out by not having the characters be the focus. Abilities are like fun little modifiers rather than entire game plans, like having a little bit of extra area denial or being able to detect nearby enemies more precisely. Very rarely will a gunfight's results be determined by what characters are in it. Despite being a hero shooter, the pillar the game is built on are the guns, the movement, the positionings, and situational awareness, each of which are super well built and deep, giving every single person who plays the game tons of room to grow and experiment. But, as I said, Apex is an exception in a sea of disappointment. Most companies don't give their developers enough space to birth something beautiful out of passion, and that's the stick that holds up the box of this whole video. Modern gaming sucks because capitalism. Games are made with money in mind first, which almost always leads to a soulless end product. But you know what else sucks? That phrase, modern gaming sucks. Both the answer and the solution to that phrase is, well, looking to the little guys. Support indie teams, do research on games before buying them, stop pre-ordering shit, and just do the bare minimum to play the modern games that don't suck, because, believe it or not, they exist and always have, just like how giant corporations have also always existed in the gaming space. Historically, publishers have always treated the ones doing the actual work like shit, going all the way back to the f***ing Atari. As you might have noticed though, time moves forward, and we move forward with it. So, to truly answer the question, why does modern gaming suck? It doesn't suck, at least not any more than any other place in time. The reason why it sucks is just different to when you were younger, because time moves forward, as should you. Stop rotting along with the games you're complaining about and move on to better things. Like, I don't know, Alter Kill's pretty good, so's Team Fortress 2. Or you could maybe move away from the shooters for a bit and try something outside your comfort zone. There's a bunch of games that I really like from different genres that are easy to get into. This, of course, is all just a personal suggestion. I ultimately don't care what you do with your time and money if it's not thrown at me personally, so, no matter what you choose to do with your life, no matter how you grow with time, I promise I'll always be here. And in the same vein, I expect to see you soon. Oh yeah, and also just so you know, I'll make an update video soon to address a couple things. I just don't want to have updates so densely packed on my channel, you know? Anyways, see you soon.